Usually when we look back at history, the start of a massive global conflict is taught to us almost like a lightning strike.
Right. Yeah, like it just happens out of nowhere.
Exactly. Like an assassination or a sudden invasion or, I don't know, some definitive line crossed in the sand.
It's the clean break.
Yeah, one day you're at peace and literally the very next day the map is redrawn and the whole world is at war. It's taught as this very clean, undeniable rupture in time.
But living through it is entirely different.
It really is. When you actually live through the build-up to something massive, it doesn't feel like a lightning strike at all. It feels more like standing on a seismic fault line.
Well, that's a great way to put it.
You feel these tiny compounding tremors beneath your feet, and you're constantly looking around wondering, was that the big one? Or is the big one still coming?
We are absolutely living in those tremors right now.
Yeah.
In this deep dive, we're taking a single, really critical excerpt titled Global Conflict and the Shadows of World War III, and we're mapping out exactly how close we are to the big one.
Which is a terrifying thought, honestly.
It is, but the ambiguity you just described, that feeling of waiting for the ground to just fully give way, that is exactly what makes the current geopolitical landscape so incredibly difficult to navigate.
Right.
It's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters on a global scale.
And just to set the stage for you listening right now, our mission today isn't to figure out who is right or wrong here.
No, definitely not.
We want to step back, look at the board, and figure out how these specific gears of conflict are turning. We're going to untangle this massive web of rising global tensions and map out the currently active conflict zones.
The ones specifically laid out in the text.
Right. And try to understand exactly where the experts draw the line between our current dangerous situation and, full-scale World War III.
It's a very fine line.
It really is. The source text directly addresses the actions and conflicts involving several specific nations: America, Israel, Iran, Russia, and Ukraine.
A lot of major players.
Yeah, and we're operating with strict impartiality here. We're simply reporting and analyzing the realities and dynamics outlined in the source text without endorsing any political viewpoints or, taking sides.
To truly understand the architecture of global conflict, we have to look at the gears turning the machine, regardless of who built the machine.
Exactly.
The text we're examining distills an enormous amount of global anxiety into a very concentrated summary of the world's current state. And it points us directly to two primary, very distinct geographic zones of conflict.
Two dual fronts.
Right, two fronts that are currently keeping the entire globe awake at night.
Okay, let's unpack this. The text identifies two distinct theaters of war operating simultaneously. First, the Middle East, specifically pointing to the conflict involving Iran, America, and Israel.
Yes.
And second, Eastern Europe, focusing on the front involving Russia and Ukraine. And the language the source uses to describe these two fronts is, it's what really stands out to me.
The specific phrasing, right?
Yeah, it doesn't just broadly state that there's violence in multiple regions. It uses very specific descriptors for the pacing of these conflicts.
Right.
Like for the Middle East, Iran, America, and Israel, the text explicitly states that the war has intensified.
Right, intensified.
Well, when it talks about the Russia and Ukraine front, it says the attacks are not stopping.
What's fascinating here is the distinction between those two states of being.
Yeah.
We're basically looking at two entirely different phenomenologies of war happening at the exact same time.
Wow, yeah.
When the text says the conflict between Iran, America, and Israel is intensifying, it's describing a war of rapid escalation.
Like a snowball effect.
Exactly. Intensification implies a feedback loop. One party takes an action to establish deterrence. The other party interprets that action as an unprovoked aggression.
And then they respond.
Right. They respond with a larger reaction to reestablish their own deterrence. Then comes an even larger retaliation. It's highly dynamic, wildly unpredictable, and it carries the constant threat of a sudden explosive peak.
It's a total escalation spiral. You never know how wide the spiral is going to get before it just loses control completely.
Exactly.
The objective is supposedly to project strength to avoid a bigger war. But the mechanics of projecting that strength actively risk triggering the bigger war.
It's a paradox.
It really is. But then, on the flip side, you have the Russia and Ukraine front. The text doesn't use the word intensifying. It says the attacks are not stopping.
Which is fundamentally different.
Yeah, that implies a completely different kind of terror.
It's the terror of endurance. a war of attrition.
Right.
When attacks are not stopping, you are dealing with a grueling, relentless grinding down of resources, infrastructure, and human willpower.
It's just constant.
Constant.
Yeah.
In an escalation spiral, the primary weapon is the threat of what you might do next. But in a war of attrition, the primary weapon is your industrial capacity to just keep going.
It's unending. You measure success not in sweeping strategic victories, but in the sheer consumption of artillery shells, the resilience of power grids under daily bombardment, and honestly, the ability of a society to withstand continuous trauma.
The psychological toll of an unending conflict like that has to be profound.
Unimaginable.
When something just doesn't stop, the surrounding world eventually risks becoming numb to it.
Right, the normalization of it.
Yeah, which allows the destruction to drag on even longer. So we have this massive volatile escalation happening in the Middle East and this relentless, unending grinding happening with Russia and Ukraine.
Side by side.
Right. And as I was reviewing this material, I kept trying to visualize how these two realities interact.
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, are we looking at two isolated house fires on opposite ends of town, or are these fires burning in a forest that is so dry they're bound to merge into one massive inferno?
Oh, that is the central anxiety of modern geopolitics, perfectly encapsulated by the source text right there.
The dry forest. Yes. Historically, conflicts could be isolated. A war could happen in one region and barely register in the daily lives of people across the globe.
Like the isolated house fires.
Exactly, much like those isolated house fires. But we do not live in that world anymore. We live in the dry forest.
Because everything is connected.
Hyper-connected.
Yeah.
Financially, digitally, logistically. The source text makes it very clear that these aren't just contained battlefields. The fires are already jumping the lines.
Bleeding out into the rest of the world.
Bleeding out everywhere, yeah.
A war of attrition requires an endless supply of resources. An escalation spiral demands constant military readiness.
Both are massive drains.
Right, and that's where this stops being a regional battlefield and starts becoming a global crisis. Because the text points to exactly how this tension is shaking the globe.
It's very specific about it.
It specifically mentions missile attacks in the Middle East and pressure on global oil routes as the primary mechanisms of disruption.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where we see the shift from a regional tragedy to a full-blown global crisis.
Okay, walk me through that.
Well, the text explicitly links these mechanisms, the missiles and the oil routes, to a global tension that has literally shaken the world. It places kinetic warfare right alongside systemic warfare.
Wait, let me challenge that for a second.
Sure.
You're saying oil routes are the transmission mechanism for this crisis. But if I'm looking at this text, actual ballistic missiles are flying between heavily armed, highly capable nations.
They are.
Isn't prioritizing oil prices and shipping routes over a literal missile escalation kind of missing the immediate existential threat? Like the fire in the sky is what causes the panic.
The fire in the sky is absolutely the immediate existential threat to the people on the ground in that specific region, without a doubt.
Right.
But in terms of global reach, the thing that shakes the entire world, as the text states, the economic weapon is arguably the more pervasive one.
How so?
You have to think of global oil routes as the circulatory system of the entire planet's economy. Okay, when the text mentions pressure on these routes, it is talking about a disruption to that circulatory system. The mechanics of modern asymmetric warfare mean a relatively inexpensive drone or missile can threaten a massive multi-million-dollar commercial vessel.
So a localized conflict suddenly has the power to basically hold global logistics hostage.
Precisely the point the text is making. Let's trace the actual mechanism of that pressure.
Yeah, let's do that.
When oil routes in the Middle East are threatened by the escalating conflict between Iran, America, and Israel, the entire logistical chain of the planet basically seizes up.
It just stops.
There starts with risk assessment. Marine insurance companies look at the missile attacks, and suddenly the premiums to insure a cargo ship passing through those waters skyrocketed by hundreds of %.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the insurance side of it.
Right, it's huge. So to avoid those costs and the physical danger, massive shipping conglomerates decide to reroute their vessels entirely.
They send them all the way around the Horn of Africa instead of going through the usual choke points.
Exactly, which adds weeks to the journey. And it burns exponentially more fuel.
Which costs more money.
And it reduces the total number of ships available globally because they are tied up on these longer routes.
So then you get a massive shortage of shipping containers.
Yes, the cost of energy jumps immediately. And when the cost of energy jumps, the cost of manufacturing jumps. The cost of transporting food jumps.
It's a domino effect.
It really is. The economic weapon degrades the stability of the entire global system.
So the pressure isn't just a military problem, it literally becomes a grocery store problem for someone thousands of miles away from the actual fighting.
Exactly.
A factory worker in a country that is entirely neutral and at peace might lose their job because the supply chain was disrupted by pressure on an oil route in a conflict zone.
It happens every day.
You don't need a missile to physically land in your hometown for you to feel the impact of this conflict.
Economics is the transmission mechanism for the trauma of war.
That's a heavy way to put it.
But it's true. The text notes that this has shaken the world. It is a literal shaking of the foundations of global stability. The kinetic weapon, the missile, destroys the immediate target. But the systemic weapon, the disruption of oil, forces the rest of the planet to share the cost of the conflict.
The circulatory system of the globe is having severe palpitations.
That's one way to say it, yeah.
Which brings us to the ultimate hovering question of the source material.
The big one.
Right. If the dual fronts are raging, if the Middle East is intensifying, if Russia and Ukraine are not stopping, and if the global economy is shaking from missile attacks and choked oil routes, are we already in a world war?
The source text addresses this directly, highlighting a very specific consensus among experts.
Okay.
It states that they're saying that right now we are not officially in World War III.
Officially?
Yeah, officially.
That word is doing a lot of heavy lifting right there.
It really is.
I mean, if all these superpowers, America, Russia, the nations of the Middle East are already involved and the global economy is fundamentally shaking, why do the experts insist we aren't officially in World War III? Like, what invisible line haven't we crossed yet?
Well, officially implies a threshold based on alliances, sovereign declarations, and formal military commitments.
Right, the legal definitions.
Exactly. And the text gives us the exact trigger that would cross that line. It warns that the situation is becoming very dangerous, and the tipping point is this. It says, if this conflict pulls in more countries, it could affect the whole world.
What does that pulling in actually look like, though? In my head, I initially pictured it like a gravitational pull, almost like a black hole sucking everything in.
It's less like gravity and more like a massive room filled with tripwires.
Okay, I can picture that.
Right now, what we have are proxy engagements, massive financial aid packages, economic sanctions, and localized kinetic engagements. America is heavily involved providing support and regional deterrence. Israel and Iran are directly engaged in that escalation spiral. Russia and Ukraine are locked in unending attacks.
What?
But these are currently contained to specific sovereign actors and their immediate proxies.
So you can have a brutal fight in the corner of that room, but as long as the fighters stay in that corner, the rest of the room stays dark.
Exactly. But the moment someone stumbles backward and hits one of those tripwires, like a mutual defense treaty or a formal military alliance, the entire grid drops on everyone.
Boom.
Right. A world war, by historical definition, requires multiple distinct nations committing their sovereign military forces to a unified theater of combat, usually bound by massive, tangled alliance networks.
Which we don't quite have yet.
Not fully. The text is warning us about the contagion effect.
Yeah.
When it talks about pulling in more countries, it is talking about the collapse of neutrality.
So as long as it's just the current players, even with the global economic shaking and the massive flow of weapons, the experts say it's not officially World War III. But the moment the escalation spiral of the Middle East or the endurance test of Eastern Europe forces a new, currently uninvolved country to formally step onto the battlefield, the threshold is crossed.
That is the breaking of the dam.
Wow.
Because once one new country is pulled in, their allies are legally and politically obligated to be pulled in, and their adversaries are subsequently pulled in.
It's a chain reaction.
A catastrophic one. The text is incredibly stark about the consequence of this threshold. It says if more countries are pulled in, the whole world will be affected.
That's chilling.
It's the transition from localized tremors to the massive seismic event.
So what does this all mean? Like for you, the person listening to this deep dive right now?
It's a lot to process.
It is. It is really easy to hear about geopolitical thresholds, global oil routes, and escalation spirals, and just feel totally overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the information.
It can feel deeply abstract.
Yeah, abstract, exactly. But what the source text is fundamentally telling you is that your daily life is tethered to this incredibly delicate balance.
It is the immediate reality of our era. You aren't just an observer watching a documentary about global politics.
No, you're in it.
You are a participant in a global economy that is currently shaking. When the experts say we are not officially in World War III yet, they aren't offering comfort.
Not at all.
They're identifying the razor's edge we are currently walking on. The difference between the current state of heightened fear and the reality of a global world war is simply the involvement of the next country.
The architecture for a global conflict is basically fully built. The fronts are active, the economic pressure points are engaged, and the major powers are positioned in the room with the tripwires.
The stage is set.
The only thing missing is the final spark that pulls the rest of the globe into the fire.
The text refers to this as the shadows of World War III for a reason. We're walking in the shadow of it. The structural conditions required for a massive global conflict are present and active.
Which brings us right back to that feeling of standing on the fault line. We've felt the tremors of the intensifying, unpredictable war between Iran, America, and Israel. We feel the unending, continuous shaking from the grinding attrition on the Russia and Ukraine front.
We feel it everywhere.
And we see the cracks forming in the global economy through the severe pressure on the oil routes. We're all just waiting to see if the ground holds.
That's the reality.
Let's do a quick recap of the journey we've taken through this text today, just to solidify these mechanics.
Good idea.
We started by mapping the two major dual fronts causing this massive global fear. We looked at the rapid, intensifying escalation spiral involving Iran, America, and Israel, a dynamic driven by the dangerous game of projecting deterrence.
And we contrasted that with the unending, relentless attacks on the Russia and Ukraine front. The text highlighted the grueling nature of a war of attrition, where success is measured by industrial stamina and the capacity to absorb unending damage rather than, sudden strategic victories.
Right. We then examined the hidden mechanisms of global disruption. We saw how the text places kinetic warfare like missile attacks right alongside systemic warfare, the pressure on global oil routes.
They go hand in hand.
Yeah, we unpacked the exact mechanism of how choking these routes acts as a force multiplier, like how a drone strike leads to skyrocketing marine insurance, which leads to rerouted shipping.
Which then transmits the shock of a regional conflict into a global economic shaking.
Exactly, hitting supply chains and grocery store prices worldwide.
Finally, we confronted the ultimate threshold, the expert consensus that we are not officially in World War III, but that we are hovering in an incredibly dangerous space.
Right on the edge.
We identified the singular trigger outlined in the text, the pulling in of more countries. We discussed how modern alliances function like a room full of tripwires. The moment the gravity of these conflicts forces a neutral nation to stumble into a mutual defense treaty, the official line is crossed, and the localized war becomes a global one.
It is a totally sobering map of our current reality. The text does not offer simple solutions. It merely holds up a mirror to the extreme fragility of the global system.
It's a stark warning.
It has been a heavy deep dive today, but I think a vital one for understanding the actual mechanics behind the headlines we're bombarded with every single day.
Absolutely.
Before we go, though, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over on your own. We've talked a lot about the threshold of pulling in more countries, and we've talked about the immense pressure on the global economy.
This raises an important question, actually, one that bridges those two concepts perfectly.
What's that?
Well, if the pressure on global oil routes continues to shake the entire world, driving up the cost of basic survival, at what point does that purely economic pressure becomes so unbearable that a currently neutral country decides their only option for national survival is to step off the sidelines and onto the battlefield?
Wow. That is a terrifying and brilliant question to walk away with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.